Hello buddy, it's Wyvern here with another historical video, and this time around we're going to be running with a slightly simpler topic, definitely simpler than our prior two historical topics, because we are going to be talking about greatswords. So no insane machines of war, rather relatively simple and elegant weapon. The Zweihander, the Greatsword, the Scottish Claymore, however you may have heard it referred to, the two-handed sword, is definitely a bit of an iconic weapon in history, and certainly an iconic and popular weapon in the world of Warhammer. And I felt it would be fun to make a video discussing how it was utilized in history, how the sort of what constitutes a greatsword, how it was designed, the service it saw, and whether or not the variant we see in Warhammer makes much, if any, sense. Now, as usual, guys, if you enjoy the video, if you find it entertaining, fun, or informative, be sure to leave a like, subscribe, and share. And if you have your own critiques, questions, or additional information, do not hesitate to post it down below. I'd really love to hear what you guys have to say. And without further ado, let's dive right into things. So first and foremost, before we discuss the combat service of greatswords and how they performed on the battlefield from the really 15th through to the 17th centuries, I think it is important that we get some definitions down, as well as perhaps clean up some potential misunderstandings about what constitutes a greatsword and what the limitations of a greatsword were. Now, first and foremost, it is important to note greatswords were an evolution of European longswords. During the 14th, 15th, even 16th centuries, longswords continued to increase in size. We saw longer and longer blades. We saw the extension of the grip to facilitate to more easily facilitate two-handed usage with hand-and-a-half swords, or bastard swords as they're sometimes called. And ultimately, this did lead to sort of the final evolution of these increasingly large blades in the form of the greatsword. Or as it would sometimes be regionally called. This, of course, came in different sort of regional variations: Zweihander or Beidenhander, the Claymore in the case of Scotland. We saw there was definitely a variety of names for these two-handed greatswords. However, they were definitely an evolution of these earlier longswords. Now, as a general class, they averaged about 60 to 70 inches in length. This is about 150 to 175 centimeters. Obviously, there were exceptions one way or another. Claymores in particular tended to be a bit shorter, and they were also a bit of an earlier form of greatsword than some of the later variations. However, this is sort of the general rule or the general trend of greatswords, that 60 to 70 inches is about the average. So they would have been about the length of the wield or the height of the wielder, if not perhaps even a little bit taller. Certainly a weapon that began to encroach upon polearm sizes. Now, second, as far as dimensions go, is weight, and this is something where I see a lot of sort of maybe not a lot, but it is, I think, relatively common for people to misconceive just how heavy a greatsword is. I've seen claims ranging from 10 to 20 pounds. Supposedly, there are even claims of people who think that, or even historians who claim that greatswords weigh as much as 40 pounds. These claims are just simply not true for most part, especially for combat greatswords. 40 pounds is absolutely ludicrous, but even 10 to 20 pounds would not have been normal for a combat greatsword. On average, combat greatswords would have ranged from about 4 to 9 pounds. Now, I have seen records of training greatswords that are actually below 4 pounds in weight. And for those of you who don't know, this is about 2 to 4 kilos that we're talking about. I've also seen greatswords that are combat-oriented greatswords that were a smidge above 9 pounds. However, in general, the general rule, 4 to 9 pounds. For ceremonial greatswords, you could see as much as 10 to 15 pounds. However, these were not intended for combat use, and you really didn't see much past that weight class. You didn't see anything at all past that weight class. So claims of 20, 30, 40 pounds, whatever they might be, are absolutely ridiculous. Greatswords were certainly not that heavy. They were also not unwieldy. You will often see claims, I think, of the greatsword being a relatively clumsy and unwieldy weapon. Now, if one attempted to wield one single-handed, yeah, that would probably be the case. However, wielded two-handed, as they were meant to be, greatswords were a relatively flexible and agile weapon, certainly. They had significant limitations in formation fighting, which we will discuss later in the video. However, as a sort of single combat weapon or as a open field weapon, they were certainly not a bad tool. They were certainly rather flexible and capable. Some of the benefits of their increased size included greater velocity at the tip of the blade. This meant that the strike would deliver greater power, potentially penetrating better or dealing a more grievous wound. It should be noted that greatswords were not particularly. Swords in general are not good against armor. Greatswords were no different from other swords in that sense. They were still not exceptional in any way against plate mail, especially, but even against sort of lower quality armors. But greatswords are certainly not designed to destroy armor. However, the added length also meant they could be wielded as a pseudo polearm. In fact, when carried from place to place, they would actually be they were not actually sheathed. There was greatswords would in fact be carried across the shoulder in much the same way as a polearm would be, and the increased length meant that, especially if using the greatsword with a half swording technique, one could have a decent amount of reach and certainly use the greatsword to deliver precise strikes with a decent amount of range, especially compared to earlier and shorter swords. Now, as far as the evolution of the greatsword and how it changed, I think it should be noted that there were a lot of regional variations on the exact greatsword design. Like we mentioned before, Scottish claymores, especially the early Scottish claymores, tended to be shorter than the later greatswords we saw, including, in fact, later Scottish claymores. However, as a general, that was sort of a general rule or generalization. Scottish claymores, early ones, tended to be a bit shorter. We also saw initially greatswords were effectively just a really long sword with a two-handed grip, an elongated two-handed grip. Later models of greatswords had parrying or parrying hooks attached to the blade, generally just past the Ricasso, which was the unsharpened portion of the blade nearest the cross guards, and these parrying hooks were obviously intended to facilitate parrying, to protect the user's hands, especially if they were attempting to use a half-handed grip, or a half-swording grip. I say half-handed. That would be tough, but a half-swording grip. Now, I should note that as far as the unsharpened Ricasso goes, I have seen a lot of claims that this was to facilitate. Well, one of the reasons for this unsharpened Ricasso was to facilitate, or more easily facilitate, a half-swording technique. However, if one examines manuals from the time period, or combat manuals from the time period, it seems that most recommend, and I have seen very few images, especially that would show sword wielders gripping the sword in the area of the Ricasso. Rather, what you will often see is that the user is gripping the blade sort of halfway down, or maybe even further. Now, on a greatsword, perhaps you cannot reach that far, not comfortably, maybe at least. However, you still don't see this. You still don't see the users really utilizing the Ricasso to grip the blade. It seems the amount of sort of visual representation of this seems to be very, very limited, which makes me doubt that it was a common occurrence. Now, certainly the parrying hooks at the end of the Ricasso sort of seem to be there to protect one's hands. However, just how often great swordsmen would actually use this Ricasso rather than reaching further down the blade to get a better grip, I'm not entirely sure, and I certainly think it's something to be wary of when discussing how exactly they were used. It is important also to keep in mind that unsharpened Ricassos were common with other swords as well. It was not exclusive to great swords. It was something also simply done to make the process of blade making cheaper and more efficient, since the blacksmith didn't have to sharpen the area. In fact, was that the base of the blade was not used for striking, was not really used in combat. It was not the portion of the blade you were trying to wound somebody with. So for that reason, the Ricasso didn't really have to be sharpened. Now, perhaps one of the most infamous or famous variations of the greatsword is the flamberge, or the Flammenschwert, the flame blade. This sort of a crazy-looking, squiggly blade. Now, there is some, I think, debate about just how, just what the reasoning behind these flame-shaped blades or flame-styled blades was. I think in general, these flame-shaped blades were simply an aesthetic choice. However, there were a few peripheral benefits to this design. One, supposedly, when parrying with a flame-bladed sword, one would transmit vibrations into their opponent's blade, which could potentially be uncomfortable or sort of disconcerting, or perhaps throw your opponent off. Now, against an experienced swordsman, just how effective this would be is debatable. Whether or not the impact would be significant enough to justify the flame blade is debatable. Another suggestion I've seen is that the Flammenschwerts, that they cut better. Now, in general, this isn't really the case. However, it should be noted that if you would be able to strike at the sort of outer edge of one of the flames, of one of the curves of the sword, it would deliver a greater amount of energy to a specific point, rather than a standard blade, which in all likelihood, or in at least some likelihood, would be delivering the blow across a greater surface area, and thus mitigate at least some of the impact. How significant this was, how practical this difference was, debatable. I think in practice, the flame blade did not really have a significant combat impact. However, it is something you see debated quite often, and it is, of course, one of the probably most famous or popular visuals of the greatsword. And so I did think that is worth bringing up here. The combat benefits of the Flamberge or the Flammenschwert probably dubious and very limited. Aesthetically, though, it looks cool. It's a rather aesthetically pleasing design. So, hey, at least it has that going for it. And that's really greatswords in a nutshell. Large two-handed blades, which could be wielded in much the same manner as a polearm in certain cases, while retaining some of the benefits of a sword. They could potentially, say, deliver a significant cut against, for example, a pike shaft or something along those lines. They could be used to cover a decent amount of. You could potentially swing the sword and get cover a good amount of area, which you could not necessarily do with, say, a pike or polearms of the period. So it was an interesting hybrid weapon, and with that out of the way, let's dive into the combat performance. So as we dive into the historical usage of two-handers in combat, we are going to be dividing things into really two categories. The first bit here, we're going to discuss the Scottish Greatsword, or the claymore. Now, this is an erroneous title. We'll get into that in just a little bit. However, that is the first weapon we're going to be discussing a little bit, because there are some tactical differences and some differences in the exact warfare that was being engaged in Scotland. That sort of made it a good weapon. Then in the second portion, we are going to discuss the Swiss and German Zweihander, or the Beidenhander, and how exactly that was used. Now, it is, of course, worth mentioning that the Greatsword was not exclusive to these nations. It was seen around Europe, from the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, Portugal, to France, Italy, England, of course, many areas, even Central Europe. The weapon was even brought further afield, especially in mercenary operations, to Central and even Southeastern Europe. And so certainly not exclusive to these countries. However, I think they are the two most notable examples. In general, greatsword usage was much more limited and much more restricted in portions of Europe outside of Scotland, and then Germany and Switzerland. And so that is really what we're going to focus on. And first and foremost, we are going to dive into the claymore. Now, as I mentioned before, this is a bit of a erroneous term. The claymore, the real claymore in history, was in fact a one-handed weapon. The Scottish basket-hilted broadsword. And this was, in fact, it was a single-handed weapon. It was a weapon from the 17th into the 18th century, and it was titled the Claidheim Moor, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing it, but that was how it was titled in Scottish Gaelic, which means greatsword, and it's where we get the word claymore from. However, later during Victorian times, the term claymore was retroactively applied to the greatswords, the two-handed greatswords utilized by the Scots during the 13th through to about the 16th centuries. And we're going to get into some discussion on some of the erroneous attributions of two-hander usage in history, where people, I think, misconstrue the claymore being described as being the two-handed weapon. Now, in this case, I'm going to use the word claymore to describe this Scottish greatsword, the Scottish two-hander. However, just do keep in mind that it is a incorrect title ultimately. The true claymore is a one-handed Scottish basket-hilted broadsword. Now, the claymores, the two-handed claymores, were a weapon that evolved during the late 13th century in much the same manner as later greatswords throughout the rest of Europe. They were essentially an evolution of the longsword. They were, however, they did have some differences from traditional greatswords that we see during the particularly 15th and 16th centuries. Claymores were generally a bit broader. They were also shorter, average length between about 55 to 60 inches. Now, there were exceptionally long variants. However, in general, it was not the case. Some early examples of what are sometimes called claymores did not have a leather-bound ricasso or a unsharpened ricasso necessarily. They were also occasionally stowed on a scabbard across the back, rather than simply the way greatswords were used in continental Europe, especially, was often they would be carried in much the same manner as a polearm. They'd be sort of laid across the shoulder when one was marching, whereas the Scottish claymore, being a bit shorter, being a bit sort of less unwieldy, would have supposedly been carried across the back in some cases. It was not I assume it was not short enough to be carried at the hip in the manner of a traditional longsword or arming sword, but supposedly across the back was something that was done. And so those were some slightly interesting differences there as far as the claymore compares to greatswords. Now, functionally, I think there's a few reasons the claymore really took off in Scotland, where it didn't get as much favor in a lot of other areas. First and foremost, I think, would have been the nature of the battles in Scotland. A lot of the fighting in Scotland was internecine clan warfare, which was generally smaller scale. The battles were not usually the battles were not of significant size. They were more along the lines of a smaller unit skirmish. You'd often be talking of numbers in the hundreds, maybe the low thousands in a lot of these engagements. And oftentimes these battles would be ambushes at relatively close range. Many of these, sometimes these battles would simply be ambushes of an enemy encampment and essentially a massacre. And in these cases where you have more room to maneuver, more room to flank and surround your opponent, the Scots also often lacked cavalry to really protect flanks. Scotland, being a somewhat poorer nation than, say, England, or much less large continental powers such as France, didn't really have the numbers of nobility or cavalry necessarily to provide as much flank security. And so I believe that in many of these smaller skirmishes, the claymore could achieve much greater results than in a large field battle. It's also worth noting that, once again, going off the theme that Scotland was a poorer nation, the arms and armor available to the soldiery there were often of lower quality than what you'd be seeing in England, and once again, not even mentioning France or nations like that. Many of the soldiers would be lucky to have, say, a helmet, a shield, and a spear, or a short pike. And in these situations, obviously, when you're dealing with opponents who do not have heavy armor, a sword is a devastating weapon. But swords generally fall flat when they are faced with various types of mail and heavier armor, because cutting weapons are in general not particularly great against armor. But when it comes to fighting unarmored or very lightly armored opponents, which much of the Scottish infantry would have been, a greatsword is definitely a brutally effective weapon. It also had some potential at sort of swatting pikes aside. What common infantry formation for the Scots was the schiltron, which was essentially a phalanx. And this spear formation could be somewhat countered by the claymore usage. They could be used to push aside enemy spears, and in such a manner. Now, perhaps the most famous early example, or early supposed example, of a greatsword wielder was William Wallace, who, of course, infamous for his defeat of the English, especially at Stirling Bridge. However, it's now sort of doubted that the blade he was using was actually a claymore. It's believed it may have been it might have actually been classified as a K-bag, which was a shorter weapon that could be wielded one-handed. However, that is perhaps one of the more infamous incidents. Now, greatswords were utilized against the English. However, the exact role here, I think, is a bit difficult to judge. One of the problems with it is that a lot of the whereas we have some specific numbers in the case of many mercenary companies as to just what percentage, or like how many sword wielders or greatsword wielders the units had, in the case of the Scots, it is a little difficult to gauge exactly how many greatsword users there were. Certainly they were used against the English. We have instances such as the Battle of Flodden in 1513, where supposedly Scottish greatswords were utilized to screen the army's flanks and to protect the pike formations flanks against the English. And this was described as being in sort of the Continental fashion at the time. So it was sort of, and the Scots were sort of picking up certain tactics or strategies from the mainland. However, as a sort of mainline weapon against the English, it does not seem to be the case. Certainly I was not able to find examples of it being sort of a major significant weapon for the Scots, especially in comparison to the pike or long spear, or or weapons, more common weapons such as the Highland halberd, or which was essentially poleaxe and such. There are also, now, one thing I will note is that claymores are claimed to have been used as late as the Battle of Killiecrankie in 1689. However, this is where we are slipping into the realm of misunderstanding. By the late 17th century, the claymores being utilized were the basket-hilted broadswords. They were no longer the two-handed weapons in general. They're often, this two-handed claymore is associated with, say, the Highland charge, a shock tactic utilized by the Scots. However, this is, in fact, a misattribution, and it's much more likely that the majority of the swords being utilized by the Scots at Killiecrankie, by the Jacobin rebels against the Scottish government, were in fact the one-handed swords. And we can kind of glean this from certain information, such as the fact that they were charging with targes in their hands as well, which would be a small shield, which would not really suggest a two-handed sword. Generally, two-handed swords were not wielded with a shield. And this is, in fact, one of the reasons I believe the two-handed swords have not been super effective against the English, because the English, starting from really the 14th and even earlier, in the 13th centuries, were becoming much more. Were beginning to use longbows, especially, but had mass firepower very prominently, and the unshielded nature of the greatsword usage, especially combined with relatively low armor of Scottish combatants, would have been a serious issue. However, at Killiecrankie, the greatswords used or the claymores used were most likely the one-handed variant. Similarly, at later battles, such as the Battle of Culloden, we've got claims of Highland charges. This was slate of 1745. Once again, the Jacobites rose up in 1745, and in 1746, they engaged the British army and found themselves defeated. But the Highland charges they utilized were not, in fact, using these great swords. For those who don't know, the Highland charge was a tactic where the Scots would close to within about 60 to 50 yards, open fire with their muskets, and then throw the weapons away and close the distance into melee, perhaps firing off pistols at shorter range if they had them. And the idea behind the tactic was that you could overwhelm an unprepared opponent very quickly, or an opponent who would sort of be taken by surprise and taken by shock and sort of fall back and retreat, and their discipline would collapse. And it was very effective at the battles such as Killiecrankie, where government forces had been newly issued with plug bayonets. They were unable to equip their plug bayonets fast enough when under the pressure of a charge to repel the Scottish attack, and the battle was over in minutes. It was an absolute massacre, essentially, and really showed how effective this tactic could be. But once again, shouldn't be associated with the two-handed claymore, which most likely phased out of service around the early 17th to late 16th. Most likely the early to mid 17th century is really when it would have phased out of service, and at least mainline service. Certainly there were still some examples of its usage, and we'll get to that at the end of the video. But as a battlefield weapon for the Scots, it was basically gone by the time of the Battle of Killiecrankie. And with that, we've kind of got a summary. The Scots, in the case of the Scots, I think the greatsword made a lot more sense than it did for a lot of the continental European nations. Or I think it makes more sense that it was used there with such prominence relative to how the Europeans used it. However, I think there should be no illusions as to its sort of ubiquitousness. It's an iconic weapon as far as the Scots are concerned. However, the vast majority of Scottish strategy and tactics still revolved around more conventional pike squares or pike formations in the vein of other European powers. The claymore would have still been very much a supplemental weapon. I think it just had more prominence and more utility due to the sort of nature of how close quarters much of the fighting often was, due to the smaller scale of especially the clan warfare, and due to the lack of armor of many of the combatants. I think in general these things combined to make the claymore a much more appealing weapon. And so, having discussed the Scots, we are going to be moving to mainland Europe to discuss the Zweihänder and how exactly it was utilized by the German mercenaries. Now, when it comes to discussing the greatsword usage on the mainland, I think it is important to keep in mind that while we will be focusing especially on the greatsword armed units in the Swiss and German armies, that greatswords were in fact utilized around all of Europe, on the Iberian Peninsula, in France, in England, Italy. We saw many units utilizing greatswords, or many nations utilizing greatswords in various capacities. However, the most significant users would have been the Swiss and the Germans. And these were also the users where, I think, when you see the tactics and the strategies used, these were often the tactics and strategies utilized with greatswords around Europe, even if they were sort of they happened to be deployed in greater quantity at a certain point in time by a nation. They would have been using similar tactics and strategies. Now, before we dive into discussing the German and Zweihander usage. I do want to get rid of what I feel is a bit of a pernicious myth or a pernicious misunderstanding, and that is the idea that a two-hander user was a Doppelsoldner or a double-paid soldier, and or that more accurately, Doppelsoldner would have been a greatsword user. Because you'll often see this, even from some respected historians and obviously the less respected internet sources, you'll often see this association of Doppelsoldners being armed with Zweihanders. Now, this is not necessarily inaccurate. Generally, the higher paid veterans and men taking part in Forlorn Hope actions at the front of the assault would be these would be the Doppelsoldners. And in the case of sort of standard men who defend the standards, men who defended the flanks, men who led the Forlorn Hope actions or defended artillery batteries, these men would have been armed with greatswords. They would have been the Doppelsoldners. However, the vast majority of Doppelsoldners would have actually been armed with conventional weapons such as the pike. They were simply men who would be fighting in the front ranks. Oftentimes these would have been veterans being paid more. However, while most or all Zweihander users would have been Doppelsoldners, nowhere near all Doppelsoldners would have been Zweihander users. And I think that is an important distinction to make here. Just so it's clear, I often see that misconception made, and the two are not equivalent. If someone says that it's a Doppelsoldner, that does not inherently mean they were a Zweihander user. And it's something important to keep in mind, I think. However, the usage of the Zweihander in European warfare had its ups and downs. It's often noted that the Swiss banned the usage of the Zweihander. This is not entirely true. Certain cantons in Switzerland, because of course Switzerland was divided up into smaller political entities. The cantons didn't have a uniform central government, and these cantons would have, some of these banned the usage of the Zweihander as a frontline weapon. However, manufacture was not banned, and on a grand scale, in a lot of cantons, the usage of this weapon was not banned in a frontline role. So keep that in mind, that it was not necessarily a weapon that was just outlawed, even though it might have been less common or less popular with certain Swiss formations. The Swiss, of course, were very fond of their pikes and often utilized halberds as a supplementary weapon. Now, the usage of the greatsword is often associated with Forlorn Hope actions, and certainly there were examples of this that we have listed in history as well as depicted in imagery. For example, at the Battle of Fornovo, we do have Italian humanist Paul Giovio describing a forlorn hope of 300 hand-picked young men who were careless of life or given up for lost, which equates with forlorn hope, sallying out with greatswords to assault the enemy phalanx. These were, I believe, from Charles VIII's of France's army. He had Swiss mercenaries in his army, and they sallied out against the imperial army. And supposedly they managed to sweep aside the enemy pikes. They managed to chop up the pikes and push the enemy aside. And essentially rout the pikemen before their reinforcements arrived. Now, we have similar instances described in battle or depicted in battles such as the Battle of Kappel in Switzerland, where supposedly the Catholics utilized the Forlorn Hope to assault the Protestant army, and supposedly that helped break them. However, keep in mind that the Battle of Kappel, the Catholics had over a 3-to-1 numerical advantage. They defeated the Protestants pretty handily. And just how significant that Forlorn Hope action would have been is questionable. However, it is worth noting that this is probably one of the most significant images that I think has established the idea that greatswords were used in a Forlorn Hope style. However, while this certainly was a manner in which they could be used, there are certain reasons that historians are dubious of how common this was and just how effective this was. First and foremost, I think it's important to keep in mind the historical texts we have available and what these say about the greatsword usage. For example, if we discuss the imperial regulations of Imperial German regulations of 1570, it's figured that of 400 men, 50 should be armed with battle swords and polearms, battle swords being greatswords, to guard the standard. Now, granted, that sounds like a lot of people to be doing to be sort of protecting a standard. However, at the same time, it does show that at least their official purpose was to be sort of performing this backline defense. When we read about battles such as Flodden, we also hear about using greatswords in a continental manner, defending the flanks, protecting the weak spots, essentially, of a pike formation, rather than being utilized in an aggressive manner. There's also practical questions about how useful a greatsword would be in this sort of frontal assault against pikes. Once the push of pike began, the greatsword user would essentially be trapped between their own pikes as well as that of the enemy. There's also the question of not having enough room to maneuver. Greatswords were not well designed for formation warfare. There were weapons where many historical weapon masters, they describe these as ideal weapons for in situations where one was faced against many. The greatsword having good reach and being capable of threatening multiple, especially lightly armored opponents at once. And once again, keep in mind that much as in the case of the Scots, the majority of European soldiery during the 16th and 17th centuries would not necessarily be clad in full plate. So once again, while certainly they would have better armor, most likely, than Scottish clansmen in, say, the 14th or 13th centuries, they would still not be fully armored. So in these situations, a greatsword could still be very effective. And in a situation where it was an urban environment, where you were trapped in sort of more compact space, perhaps against multiple opponents, the additional reach, the wide swing of a greatsword made it a good made it a good weapon. However, in a straight-up formation fight, it would not have been as effective. It's likely that the greatswords would have been much more efficient attacking from the flanks. There's also the question of how effective they would have been at chopping down pikes. Now, certainly, a greatsword could cleave through a pike if it was given the appropriate angle and sort of positioning. However, many of the pikes, or most of the pikes most likely at the time, would have had lancets by sort of reinforcing the pike head, and chopping through these with the sword would have been incredibly difficult. You would have had to strike further down the shaft, which would be tough to sort of reach that sort of position. What's more likely is that greatswords were kept as sort of a reserve, kept to protect important personnel, kept back to defend officers or artillery crews, protect the flanks of the pike formations, and perhaps utilized to flank the enemy rather than being used in this aggressive frontal assault manner. By the really the mid till really the late 16th century, we see by and large greatswords being supplanted by halberds, especially in this push of pike sort of role. Due to the fact that you need more room to maneuver a greatsword to really get full effect, it wasn't, like I mentioned before, it wasn't really designed ideally for formation fighting. And so if you were just trying to help a pike formation in close quarters in a push of pike situation, halberds were generally better. They performed better against armor. They were better at pulling down cavalrymen. One of the things I think a lot of people don't understand about pike formations is that against barded warhorses and full plate mail armored knights, they were often not as effective as one would think. It's not like anti-large in Warhammer and Total War, where it just kills a knight. Pikes could, in fact, be pushed through by cavalry, and in fact, it did occasionally occur at certain battles, such as the Battle of Marignano. So it's worth keeping in mind that heavy cavalry could absolutely be a threat to the to pike formations, and in those cases, a halberd, with its ability to pull cavalrymen off the horse, with its ability to penetrate heavy armor, and its viability in a restricted space where you couldn't swing the weapon side to side, made it a much more appealing weapon than a greatsword. However, it did remain. Certainly, the greatsword didn't sort of just pass away and disappear. It retained this function even after the mid 16th century as a supports tool, as a sort of bodyguard weapon, as a weapon designed essentially for defense against unarmored opponents, maybe for defending for defending important persons, for defending transports or in these smaller scale bodyguard type situations. Is where they really continue to perform. However, their sort of massive popularity they enjoyed, or relatively massive popularity they enjoyed at the beginning of the 16th century, had largely passed by the mid to late 16th century. It should be noted that oftentimes that the ratio of greatswords was never sort of massive. If we take as an example, a case of the Black Band, a unit of Landsknechts or German mercenaries founded in the early 1500s in 1514. Of their force of 17,000 men, 2,000 were two-handed swordsmen. The rest of the force was largely pikemen, 12,000, 2,000 arquebusiers, and 1,000 halberdiers. Interestingly enough, the two-handed swordsmen did in fact outnumber the halberdiers, which actually surprised me in this situation. I kind of expected that the more versatile in push of pike situations, halberds would have been more popular. However, the two-handed swordsmen, in fact, were the more common choice in 1515. So I did think that was a bit of an interesting case. However, the sort of popularity that we saw for the greatswords during battles such as the Battle of Marignano, the battles of Pavia, the battles such as Capel and Fornovo and these engagements, this popularity would never really reoccur. Now, ultimately, the greatsword, as well as the halberd, and ultimately really even the pike, would be supplanted or replaced by the handgun. But the greatsword was really the first of these weapons to go, as military tacticians found that handguns were essentially better at breaching enemy pike formations. You'd simply gun the enemy down until you forced a breach. And what had at first begun as sort of one supplementary arm in push of pike situations, guns slowly began to take up more and more room within these pike formations. More and more of the manpower was being dedicated to these weapons. Greatswords would be one of the first weapons to go. Halberds essentially fell out of service at a similar time. They lingered on a little bit longer from most of the records I've been able to find. However, really not exactly, they didn't really stick around for a super long time. Halberds did enjoy slightly protracted survivability in the sense that they were used as a tool of office for a lot of sergeants and lower officers, more so to direct their formations of gunners, or sort of to give direction or give commands, rather than actually being a tool of war, whereas the greatsword just kind of fell out of this use and moved towards a more civilian area of service. Ultimately, guns would supplant pikes as well. Simple fact was that, well, once bayonets came around, pikes, even pikes fell by the wayside, and by the 18th century, you essentially saw pikes even pikes removed. So in the space of about 100 years, we saw great swords, halberds, and ultimately even pikes being removed from mass service. Now, greatswords did have a sort of decent impact in the civilian realm, as we discussed before, good for bodyguard service. They also found some usage with various pirates and insurrectionists and such civilian forces. Perhaps one of the most infamous examples being Grote Pier in the early 1500s and the early 16th century. Piers Gerlof's Donia, a Frisian rebel and pirate. He supposedly utilized a greatsword. He was apparently a man of great stature, and supposedly there are claims that he could decapitate multiple foes at once with a single stroke of his greatsword. How much of this was imagination or exaggeration as opposed to reality, that is of course debatable. However, it is an interesting early case of sort of greatswords in civilian, or well, I say civilian, but in outside of the military sphere, and just an interesting example of how this weapon came to find a place even in the sort of popular culture of the time. But as mentioned, the greatsword did kind of fall by the wayside with the advent of gunpowder in mass quantity. Now, in the world of Warhammer, I think greatswords in many ways, well, they make sense. Now, their depiction in Total War as an armor-piercing unit is a bit ridiculous. Greatswords are not good against armor. They can certainly be used against armor if needed, with a half-sword and grip. Taking advantage perhaps of the unsharpened Ricasso, or the length, and especially the length of the blade, reaching down further to sort of penetrate unarmored or thinner armored portions of your opponent's body. Certainly, a greatsword could do that work. However, as a specialized armor-piercing tool, it was really not designed for that. Greatsword's performance against armor was rather pitiful. It suffered from the same issues of any other bladed weapon. It just wasn't good at armor penetration. However, for chopping up lightly armored opponents, which is kind of the majority of what the Empire does in Warhammer, they fight orcs, they fight Chaos Marauders. Most of the Chaos Force, of course, are Marauders. Beastmen, of course, are too stupid to make much armor. Pansy Wood Elves, under-trained Bretonnian peasantry. Really, the vast majority, really Skaven trash. Most of the troops that the Empire faces are lightly armored and ill-equipped. Against such weapons, against such troops, a greatsword is a useful weapon. Even more so when you're talking about factions that are not very good at formation fighting. Greatswords are not necessarily a great weapon for formation fighting, which is one of those interesting things that they are sort of used in formations, or dedicated sort of square formations in the world of Warhammer. But in practice, they were definitely not a great weapon for formation fighting. But if you're fighting opponents who are not good at formation fighting either, the greatsword could definitely have, I think, a moment to shine. Once again, being that sort of weapon that's good against, when it's a situation of one against many, would really enable this sort of heavy bladed weapon to do its work. And understand, when I say heavy, I don't mean really heavy. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, greatswords were certainly not the heaviest of tools, but relative to other swords, they were. And so that is essentially the greatsword in a nutshell. I think that in the case of Warhammer, it makes sense. Not necessarily for the reasons or the ways it's depicted in game or in tabletop. It's not a great formation weapon. It is not a good armor-piercing weapon. However, it is definitely a good weapon against infantry. That is one thing that's well represented, I think. It was not necessarily a good weapon against cavalry, due to the reduced reach compared to something like, say, a halberd, as well as the lack of, say, a spike to yank in a horseman off his horse, that sort of thing. But certainly a very potent anti-infantry weapon, especially against lightly armored infantry. Certainly had this benefit against mobs of lightly armored opponents. And that makes, in my opinion, means that it makes at least some sense, especially for the more elite sort of factions that use them, with the Empire, and then to an extent the elves and dark elves who use them. Yeah, I do hope you guys enjoyed the video. I found it hopefully educational and informative and fun to listen to. As usual, leave your own comments, critiques, questions down below. I'll be more than happy to read and answer. If you have your own input, always good to spread the knowledge. So if you have your own take on things, if you've got other information that I just didn't share, whether I didn't get around to it or I didn't find it, be sure to post it down below. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. Do hope you guys enjoyed. I'll see you all in the next one. Bye for now.